The knife entered the man's throat so smoothly he didn't have time to scream. Park Min-ji withdrew the blade with the same clinical precision a surgeon might use, watching without emotion as blood sprayed across the warehouse wall in an arc that almost looked artistic. The body crumpled, and Min-ji was already moving to the next target, his footsteps silent despite the pools of crimson spreading across the concrete floor. 3 men had thought they could steal from him. 3 men had believed their connections would protect them. 3 men now decorated the floor like broken mannequins, their eyes still open in permanent shock. This was who Park Min-ji was. The Black Requiem. The name whispered in boardrooms and back alleys, spoken with the kind of reverence reserved for natural disasters and acts of God. For 20 years, he had ruled Seoul's underworld with an iron fist wrapped in expensive silk, a man who killed so quietly that victims were found looking peaceful, as if death had been a gift rather than a punishment. Mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. Grown men crossed the street when they saw his car approaching. And women, even the boldest ones, prayed they would never catch his attention. But one woman had. A girl, really. And that single fact was about to unravel everything he had built. 15 years ago, Min-ji had walked into a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Seoul, a Glock in his hand and murder in his heart. Kwame Njeri, a Kenyan businessman who had been living in Korea for 6 years, had made the kind of mistake that usually resulted in entire families disappearing. He had accidentally disrupted one of Min-ji's arms shipments, causing a delay that cost millions and nearly exposed the entire operation to law enforcement. It was the kind of error that demanded blood payment. Kwame had opened the door knowing death stood on the other side. His wife was already dead, taken by cancer 3 months prior, leaving him alone with his 5-year-old daughter who barely understood Korean and clung to her father's leg like it was the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. Min-ji had stepped inside, gun raised, finger on the trigger, and then he had seen the child. She was tiny, with large dark eyes that reflected the overhead light, her hair in small braids tied with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved. She stared at Min-ji without comprehension, without fear, because at 5 years old she didn't yet understand that some men were monsters in human skin. She smiled at him, a gap-toothed expression of innocent friendliness, and held up a drawing she had been working on. "Look," she said in broken Korean. "I drawed a flower." Min-ji had looked at Kwame, at this man who was shaking so hard his teeth chattered, and made a decision that would haunt them both for the next 15 years. "I could kill you," he said softly. "I should kill you. But I'm going to offer you something else. A debt. A promise." "Anything," Kwame whispered. "Please, she's all I have. When she turns 20, she becomes mine. She will live in my house, under my protection, bound to me in whatever way I choose. In exchange, you live. You both live. But the debt remains, Kwame. Always." Kwame had agreed because what choice did he have? You didn't negotiate with the Black Requiem. You took the mercy he offered and thanked whatever gods still listened that you weren't bleeding out on your kitchen floor. And so Amina Njeri grew up under a shadow she didn't understand, her father's increasing anxiety as her 20th birthday approached, the way he looked at her sometimes with love and guilt in equal measure. The black cars arrived on a Tuesday morning, exactly 20 years after Amina had taken her first breath. She stood at the window of their apartment, watching as 3 vehicles pulled up, sleek and expensive, the kind of cars that didn't belong in neighborhoods like hers. Men in suits emerged, their faces professional and cold, and she felt her stomach drop because she had heard the stories. Every Korean child had heard the stories about the Black Requiem, about what happened to people who owed him debts. "Papa," she said, her voice small and frightened. "What's happening?" Kwame couldn't look at her. He had spent 15 years trying to find a way out of the promise he had made, 15 years searching for loopholes or alternatives or some way to save his daughter from a fate he didn't fully understand. But debts to men like Park Min-ji didn't have escape clauses. They were written in blood and sealed with fear. "You have to go with them," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I'm so sorry, Amina. I'm so sorry." She was taken to a mansion on the outskirts of Seoul, a sprawling compound that looked more like a fortress than a home, with walls topped with security cameras and guards stationed at every entrance. Inside, everything was pristine and cold, decorated with the kind of expensive minimalism that suggested no one actually lived there. They left her in a sitting room, and she waited with her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst through her ribs. When Park Min-ji finally entered, she understood why people were afraid. He was 40 years old, tall and imposing, with sharp features that could have been handsome if they held any warmth. But his eyes were empty, dark and flat like a shark's, and when he looked at her, she felt like prey being assessed by a predator deciding whether to strike. "Amina and Jerry," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a judgment. "Do you know why you're here?" "My father's debt," she whispered, her hands twisting in her lap. "He said I belong to you now." "Yes." Min-ji moved to a cabinet and poured himself whiskey, his movements precise and controlled. "Your father made a promise 15 years ago, and I am here to collect. You will live in this house. You will follow my rules. You will not leave without my permission. Do you understand? Are you going to kill me?" The question seemed to surprise him. He turned, studying her with those dead eyes, and for a moment something flickered across his face, too fast to identify. "No. I am not going to kill you." "Then what do you want from me?" Her voice broke on the question because she had heard the stories about what powerful men did to girls like her, about the ways they collected on debts that involved young women. She was terrified of the answer but needed to hear it anyway. Min-ji set down his glass with a soft click. "I want you to live here. Cook if you wish. Read. Occupy the space. But you will be available when I require your presence. That is the debt. Your life in exchange for your father's. Will you?" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that had been growing since the cars arrived. "Touch you?" Min-ji's expression hardened. "No. Not unless you ask me to. I am many things, Amina, but I am not that kind of monster." The relief that flooded through her was so intense she felt dizzy. But confusion quickly followed because if he didn't want her body, didn't want her dead, what exactly did he want? What kind of debt was paid with simple presence? The first weeks in the mansion were strange and isolating. Min-ji was rarely home, gone for days at a time on business she didn't want to understand. When he was present, he barely acknowledged her, moving through the house like a ghost, his attention focused on phone calls and meetings conducted in his study. But she noticed things. The way his men fell silent when he entered a room. The way his voice, even at normal volume, carried absolute authority. The way blood sometimes stained his cuffs, quickly changed before anyone else could notice. Amina tried to make the house feel less like a tomb. She cooked meals from recipes her father had taught her, filling the kitchen with smells of spices and comfort. She bought plants for the empty rooms, small pots of green that made the space feel alive. She rearranged furniture in her bedroom, creating a small sanctuary where she could pretend she was somewhere else, someone else. And Min-ji watched. She didn't realize it at first, but he was always watching, studying her from doorways and through security footage, trying to understand this small woman who had been thrust into his world and refused to simply exist quietly. She brought chaos to his ordered life, and he found himself drawn to it the way people are drawn to fires. 3 months after her arrival, he surprised her by sitting down at the dinner table instead of taking his meal in his study. She had made ugali and sukuma wiki, Kenyan dishes that reminded her of her mother, and the smell had apparently drawn him from his usual isolation. "Eat with me," he said, and it wasn't a request. Amina sat across from him, her hand shaking slightly as she served him food. They ate in silence for several minutes, the only sound the soft clink of silverware against plates. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. "Why did you really spare my father?" she asked quietly. "Men like you don't show mercy without reason." Min-ji's jaw tightened. "Who told you what kind of man I am?" "Everyone knows what kind of man you are. The Black Requiem. The devil in a suit. The men who kill so quietly people don't realize they're dead until they stop breathing. And yet you sit here, questioning me. Because I have nothing left to lose. You already own everything I am." He set down his fork, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "I spared your father because you smiled at me. A child's smile, meaningless and pure, and it reminded me that I was human once. That there was a time before I became this." He gestured to himself, to the expensive clothes and cold expression. "I took you as collateral not because I wanted to own you, but because I wanted to remember what innocence looked like. What softness felt like. Everything in my world is hard and sharp and violent. You were different. I'm not innocent anymore, Amina said softly. Living here, knowing what you do, seeing the blood on your clothes even when you try to hide it. That changes a person. Yes. It does. Min-ji stood, and for a moment she thought he was angry, thought she had crossed some invisible line. But instead, he simply said, "You cooked too little. Make more next time. I'll eat with you again." It became a routine. Dinner together 3 nights a week, then 4, then every night he was home. They talked about small things at first, safe topics like weather and food and books. But gradually, carefully, they began to reveal pieces of themselves. He told her about growing up in orphanages, about learning to fight because it was the only way to survive, about building an empire from nothing because power was the only protection that mattered. She told him about her mother's death, about feeling displaced in a country that looked at her as foreign despite Korea being the only home she remembered, about the loneliness that came from being different. "Do you hate me?" he asked one night, months into their strange coexistence. Amina considered the question carefully. "I don't know. I should. You took my life, my choices, everything that made me free. But you're not what I expected. You're not cruel. You're just empty." Empty. He tested the word like it was foreign. "Yes. That's accurate. What made you that way?" "Everything." His voice was flat, emotionless, but she could hear the weight beneath it. "Every betrayal. Every death. Every moment I chose survival over humanity. After a while, you stop feeling things because feeling means hurting, and hurt is weakness. That sounds like a terrible way to exist. It's the only way I know how." Something shifted between them that night, some invisible wall beginning to crack. Min-ji started coming home earlier, reducing the hours he spent in his underground world of violence and crime. He would find Amina in the garden she had created, surrounded by flowers and herbs, and he would sit nearby, not speaking, just existing in the same space. She would read aloud sometimes, Korean novels with happy endings that made him uncomfortable because he had forgotten what happiness looked like. His men noticed the change. The Black Requiem who had once worked 18-hour days now left meetings early. The men who had never shown mercy now occasionally stayed his hand when violence might have been his first response. Whispers spread through the organization, speculation about what the Kenyan girl had done to their boss, whether she was a weakness they could exploit. 6 months after Amina arrived, Min-ji did something unprecedented. He took her out. Not to a restaurant or formal event, but to a night market in a working-class neighborhood where no one knew his face. They wore ordinary clothes, and he bought her street food, watching with something almost like pleasure as she tasted Korean treats she had never tried before. "Why are we here?" she asked, her mouth full of hotteok, her eyes bright with the kind of simple joy he had forgotten existed. "Because you've been locked in that house for half a year. Because you deserve to remember what normal feels like. This isn't normal for you." "No. But maybe it should be." When she smiled at him, genuinely happy for the first time since she had been taken from her father's apartment, Min-ji felt something crack open in his chest, something painful and terrifying and completely unwelcome. He was falling for her. The Black Requiem, the men who had sworn off any attachment that could be used against him, was falling for a 20-year-old girl who made him want to be something other than a monster. The realization terrified him more than any enemy ever had. He tried to pull back after that night, tried to rebuild the distance between them. But it was too late. She had already found her way past his defenses, had already made him care in a way he had promised himself he never would again. And caring, as he had learned long ago, was the most dangerous thing a man like him could do. The attack came on a Tuesday morning while Amina was at the market buying vegetables. Min-ji's rivals had been watching, waiting for the perfect moment, and they struck with brutal efficiency. 3 men, professional and prepared, grabbed her in broad daylight and threw her into a van before anyone could react. By the time Min-ji's security detail realized what had happened, she was already gone. The video arrived 2 hours later, delivered to his headquarters by anonymous courier. Min-ji watched it alone in his office, his hands steady despite the rage and fear building in his chest like a storm. Amina was tied to a chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, her face already showing bruises, her eyes wide with terror. A man stood behind her, a knife pressed to her throat, his face covered but his voice full of mockery. Park Min-ji. The Black Requiem. The devil himself. We've heard so much about you. How you're untouchable. How you feel nothing. But we found your weakness, haven't we? This pretty little thing you've been keeping. We wonder how much she's worth to you. How much you'll pay to get her back. Or if you'll even care when we send her back to you in pieces. The video ended with Amina whimpering as the knife pressed harder against her skin, drawing a thin line of blood. Min-ji played it again. And again. And again. His face remained expressionless, but inside, something was breaking. Not rage. Not the cold fury he usually felt before violence. This was different. This was fear, raw and primal, the kind that came from caring about something so much that losing it would destroy you. Amina, he whispered to the empty room, her name a prayer and a curse. Then the Black Requiem returned in full force. Min-ji's response was immediate and absolute. He called in every favor he had accumulated over 20 years, activated every network, mobilized every resource. He burned down safe houses belonging to rival gangs, tortured information from anyone who might know anything, offered rewards large enough to bankrupt smaller organizations. He declared what amounted to martial law in the underworld, shutting down operations across Seoul until someone gave him what he wanted. Find her, he told his lieutenants, his voice quiet and more terrifying because of it. Find her now, or everyone dies. It took 6 hours to track down the warehouse. 6 hours of Amina enduring pain and terror while the men who had claimed to own her tore the city apart looking for her. When Min-ji finally kicked down the door of the abandoned building, he was alone, having sent his men away because what he was about to do required no witnesses. The massacre was silent and efficient. 7 men died before they could even reach for their weapons, Min-ji moving through the space like death-given form. He broke bones with clinical precision, ended lives with quick efficiency, transformed the warehouse into a monument to what happened when someone touched what belonged to him. The last man, the one who had held the knife to Amina's throat, tried to run. Min-ji caught him at the door and spent 3 minutes ensuring his death was neither quick nor painless. Then he found her. Amina was still tied to the chair, her face swollen, her body shaking with shock. Her eyes were unfocused, staring at nothing, and when Min-ji knelt in front of her, she flinched away. "It's me," he said softly, his hands shaking as he cut through the ropes. "Amina, it's me. You're safe now." "Why did you come?" she whispered, her voice broken. "Why didn't you just let them kill me? Then you'd be free of the debt, free of the burden." Min-ji's composure shattered. His hands cupped her face gently, forcing her to look at him, and for the first time in decades, emotion flooded his features. "Because losing you is the one thing even I cannot survive. Because somewhere in the last 6 months, you stopped being a debt and became the only thing I care about. Because I love you, and if they had killed you, I would have burned this entire city to the ground and then followed you into whatever hell awaits men like me." Tears streamed down her face. "You love me. God help me, yes." He carried her out of that warehouse like she weighed nothing, cradling her against his chest while she cried into his shirt. His men cleaned up the bodies, but Min-ji didn't care about covering his tracks or maintaining deniability. Let the police come. Let his rivals see what he had done. Let everyone know that Amina in Jerry was under his protection, and touching her meant death. The next 3 days, Min-ji didn't leave her side. He sat by her bed while doctors treated her injuries, held her hand when nightmares woke her screaming, cleaned her wounds with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that had killed so many. And when she was finally stable enough to talk, he told her everything. "I never touched you because I was afraid I would break something so soft," he said quietly. "My entire life has been violence and control. Everything I touch turns to blood and ash. You were this bright, gentle thing that somehow ended up in my world, and I thought if I kept my distance, maybe you wouldn't be corrupted by what I am. But I was wrong. The distance didn't protect you. It just made you vulnerable." Amina's hand found his, her fingers intertwining with his despite the bandages. "I don't need protection from you. I need you to stop treating me like I'm fragile. I survived my mother's death. I survived growing up foreign in a country that didn't want me. I survived 6 months in the house of the most dangerous men in Korea. I'm stronger than you think. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. Then stop being afraid of breaking me and just love me. That's all I've wanted since the night you told me about your past. I see you, Min-ji. Not the Black Requiem, not the devil everyone fears. Just you. The man who buys me street food and sits in my garden and looks at my plants like they're miracles. That's who I love. I don't deserve you. Probably not. But you have me anyway. He kissed her then, carefully, like she might disappear if he held too tight. And Amina kissed him back, her hands pulling him closer, proving that she wasn't afraid of what he was or what he had done. She had walked into hell and decided to stay, not because she had to, but because somewhere in the darkness, she had found something worth holding on to. The underworld learned quickly that Amina in Jerry was untouchable. Min-ji reduced his direct involvement in operations, delegating more to trusted lieutenants, spending his time building a life instead of an empire. He strengthened security around the mansion, hired permanent guards whose only job was protecting her, made it clear that anyone who even looked at her wrong would face consequences more severe than death. But more than that, he changed. The Black Requiem didn't disappear, but he became something more complex, something that could balance violence with tenderness, power with love. He learned to laugh at Amina's jokes, to help her cook meals even though he was terrible at it, to sit with her in the garden and talk about futures that involved more than just survival. One night, 8 months after she had been taken, Min-ji found Amina on the balcony, staring at the Seoul skyline. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, and for a moment, they just existed together in comfortable silence. "You were a debt once," he said quietly. "A promise I made to your father because I wanted to remember what innocence looked like. But you're not a debt anymore, Amina. You're my choice. My peace. The only softness in a life that's been nothing but sharp edges." She turned in his arms, her hands cupping his face, and smiled with the same gap-toothed expression she had worn at 5 years old, except now it held knowledge and pain and love in equal measure. "And you're my monster. The devil I was supposed to fear but ended up loving instead. Is that enough? Can you really love a man who's killed more people than he can count? Who's done things that would make you sick if you knew the details? I don't love you despite what you are. I love you because you showed me that even devils can choose to be human. Even monsters can learn to be gentle. And that's worth everything." When she kissed him, Min-ji felt something he had thought was dead forever: hope. Hope that maybe he could be more than just the Black Requiem. Hope that love wasn't weakness but strength. Hope that two broken people could build something beautiful from the wreckage of debt and fear and violence. The city below continued its endless dance of light and shadow, crime and punishment, predators and prey. But on that balcony, in the arms of a woman who had somehow tamed the devil himself, Park Min-ji finally understood what it meant to be human. If this story of unlikely love and impossible redemption has captured your heart, make sure to hit that subscribe button because we have more dark romances coming that will test everything you think you know about love and monsters. Drop a comment and tell me, do you believe someone like Min-ji can truly change, or will his past always define him? And if you want to see more stories where love blooms in the darkest places, smash that like button to let us know. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing a devil can do is fall in love, because love makes even the untouchable vulnerable, and vulnerability in a world of monsters is the bravest act of all.